Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another short of Real Talk with Shan and Bilal. I am Shan, and it's going to be another short because me and Bilal have not been getting enough time to record a fully fleshed podcast with the both of us. In fact, we are planning to get the fifth episode of our first season out to you guys as soon as possible, possibly within the next 1 or 2 weeks. But for now, I'm going to be talking about Generation Z as part of this short of Real Talk with Shan and Bilal on my part. So, Generation Z is the generation that is commonly referred to as born after 1998. Now, although it's the turn of the millennium, many believe that Generation Z, which succeeds the millennial generation, is going to be, as per surveys and a bunch of sociological studies, the most conservative generation than the silent generation, which was the post-World War II generation that preceded the baby boomer era that started in the late 1940s. So only 22% of all Gen Z Americans are past their earliest developmental years, which is the ages between 3 and 8. And a 2016 American study from the American University found that while only 18% of millennials attended church attendance was 41% amongst Generation Z. So we're going to kick it off with religion. It tends from this survey that people in Generation Z are more inclined to follow a certain guideline, a certain set of guidelines for their religion than are millennials, which is really a throwback to religious conservatism. And a poll found that 8 out of 10 Americans of Gen Z American citizens consider themselves fiscally conservative, which is more monetary policy-based legislation and policy rather than Keynesian policy, rather than fiscal policy, rather than the government coming up with new welfare programs to try and stimulate the economy. Rather, they Gen Zers are more inclined for market-based economic systems and market-based feasible economic systems rather than government-based systems to stimulate the economy, as they're a more Austrian economists. In certain areas, it has been proven that Generation Z is more risk averse than the millennial generation. In fact, in 2013, 66% of teenagers had tried alcohol, down from the 82% in 1991. So there's a huge generational gap. There's almost 16% difference between the peak years of Gen Z and the peak years of the millennial era and people growing up in millennial culture, the midst of both. Now, a 2016 survey done by the Annie Casey Foundation found that Generation Z had lower teen pregnancy rates, less substance abuse, and higher on-time high school graduation rates compared to millennials, which is a huge boost in terms of minorities in this country, especially Hispanics and blacks, who are graduating at higher rates than any other generation in the history of this country. Even millennials, the most liberal generation, did not have as much of a growth of high school graduation rates in black and Hispanic communities as does the Z generation, the current generation. Business Insider describes Generation Z as more conservative, more money-oriented, more entrepreneurial, and pragmatic about money compared to millennials. And this is why you'll see they're more entrepreneurial. They have a lot of startups. There's more, on average, more startups of Gen Z-oriented companies than millennial-driven companies. And why this may be the case, and why this makes sense contextually, is because most people who are in this generation of Gen Z have watched their parents live through the second worst economic decline in American history, which started in 2008. This, of course, was the 2008 stock market crash, and have witnessed the aftermath of mass layoffs and rampant foreclosures. Personally speaking, I didn't have to witness this because my parents, my dad was the only one working in 2008, and he still kept his job. I believe he still worked at MetLife back then, and he did not get laid off because he wasn't in a financial institution-oriented company back then. So I am very grateful to that. But most Gen Zers did have at least 1 or 2 family members that were laid off during that time, which made them more fiscally conservative and really instilled within them a lack of trust of government programs to help stimulate the economy, which was mainly driven by the Obama administration's efforts to stimulate the economy post the recession, which didn't really work as well as he would have liked, as well as the American people would have liked. Moving on, one British study conducted by global consultancy firm The Guild found that Gen Z participants are 10 times more likely than millennials to dislike tattoos and body piercings. Now, this is another cultural aspect of conservatism, which is more apparent through Gen Z than the liberalism of millennials. Gen Z is also extremely diverse, the most diverse group of people in this country. Now, this personally has nothing to do with liberalism versus conservatism, because this is a demographic shift that has been going on in this country in the post-World War II era, where immigration has ramped up, amnesty for illegals crossing the southern border, as well as coming from places like Europe and Eastern Asia, have gone up. More people are getting amnesty, especially under the DACA Act, which is under fire in the Trump administration and has been rescinded by the DOJ and Attorney General Jeff Sessions. But it has given more amnesty to people than in the history of this country, which has contributed to the massive demographic shifts in this country. In fact, only 55% of this generation is Caucasian, 24% Hispanic, 14% African American, 4% Asian, and 4% mixed race. What's also, in a political sense, interesting is that 32% of Gen Zers in the 2016 election would have voted for Trump. Only 22% for Hillary and 31% neither in a Gallup poll survey that was conducted after the election. And this is very interesting to me because, not because more people would vote for Trump than Hillary. Coming into this video, this podcast, I understood that more people would vote for Trump than Hillary because it is a more conservative-leaning generation. But the fact that 31% neither, that shows that there could be more of an independent movement in politics arising, which really was spearheaded by the Bernie Sanders campaign, because he wasn't really a Democrat or a Republican. He was a mayor of Burlington, then he was a senator from Vermont who is not party affiliated, and he quit the Democratic Party after he lost the primaries. So I feel like a lot of people, though not politically because he is an ultra-liberal, he considers himself a democratic socialist, which is far left on the spectrum. A lot of people on both the right and the left have really started to think about other options, other alternative options of the two-party system that we are currently in. Moving on, Gen Zers are more risk-averse and financially conservative, as I've mentioned before, and they are less prone to activism and more to systemic reform through politics and legislative processes, which is a stark contrast from now, as you have a lot of activist groups such as Antifa, Black Lives Matter on the far left, which have formed very recently in the past decade or so. Black Lives Matter, in fact, I think in 2014, in response to the 2014 shootings in Ferguson, Missouri, after the death of Michael Brown. So this definitely makes more sense in terms of centricism, political, cultural, and social centricism now taking a hold in this generation. Now, there are some ways in which Gen Z has maintained the level of liberalism of the millennial generation that preceded it. 75% of Gen Zers support same-sex marriage, and because they're more likely to have grown up around same-sex parents and therefore don't see this as unusual or illegal. 76% are concerned about global warming, which makes sense due to the rise of natural calamities and disasters that we have been accustomed to seeing as of late. I mean, there were 3 major hurricanes just this year alone. Hurricanes Irma, Harvey, and Hurricane Maria, the latter of the last of the 3, which devastated Puerto Rico. And as a result of their fiscal financial conservatism, they're also less likely to believe that there is a such thing as the American dream, which makes sense in the aftermath of the 2008 stock market crash. They've also, this is one thing that really kind of surprised me considering how conservative it is. According to many surveys, most Gen Zers will support gun control as a result of the rise of mass shootings and the rise of coverage of mass shootings in this country, especially the one in a Texas church a few months ago. In fact, last month, I believe, the deadliest mass shooting on U.S. soil, which took place in Las Vegas about 1.5 months ago. So this rise in mass shootings and the coverage of mass shootings has really stigmatized guns to this generation. with many experts being led to believe that we are more inclined to vote for gun control legislation and support gun control causes. So overall, for the most part, I do agree with most of the points that are being made here from a personal point of view, because I identify as a conservative, more conservative than liberal, and I identify as an independent as well, because I'm not party affiliated, as this article has said previously, that almost 31% of Generation Z people would not have supported either political candidate or political party in the 2016 election. So there's a rise of an independent political movement, although there are more people who are conservative in this generation than liberal, which I definitely identify with. And most of these causes, both conservative and liberal, fiscal conservatism, social liberalism in the sense of same-sex marriage and global warming, I also tend to align with. So overall, my opinion on this is it's nothing out of the ordinary. I mean, the U.S. politics has always been a pendulum of left and right and left and right. I mean, it's been going on since the silent generation, and the baby boomers were one of the most conservative generations after the silent generation, and then they were succeeded by Gen X, which was one of the more liberal, then Gen Y, which was more centrist, and then the millennials, who were the most liberal generation since Gen X, and now you have Gen Z, which is back to the right. So it's a cyclical pattern between left and right. It's really nothing to be concerned about if you're on the left, because personally, what I've been noticing in this country is that movements have tend to gone to the fringier, either if you're talking about the far left or the far right, and that's something that our country has for the most part avoided in the past. Usually, the left and the right come to confounding consensus on many policy issues, and many studies show that even right now, politically, we agree more than ever, but culturally, we are more divided than ever. So I am very glad that in the next generation, there's a higher chance of political and social tolerance than before, and more centricism, more slightly skewed to conservatism, which, since I'm a conservative, I am biased towards. But for the most part, I am very happy that this country has headed towards centricism over anything else. With that, I will conclude this episode of a short, on my part, in this short series of Real Talk with Shan and Bilal. We'll be back with another fully fleshed podcast of me and him talking about the second episode of State After the Secretary, as the plans are going on right now. So thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for tuning in.